Lisa Gouthrope from Bond University, who's not here, and Darryl Adair from the University of Technology in Sydney, who is standing in the middle there. We'd like to thank you for attending our panel discussion on who has the right to stand up for the athlete voices. Our research team is currently examining different types and roles of athlete representation in the elite sports governance system. We are currently recruiting participants for this particular study, so if you're an elite athlete who's interested in, who is a athlete representative in some way, shape or form and is interested in participating through an interview, please contact myself or Darryl or Annette. In person, there's flyers that we have that has contact information if you'd also like to get in contact with us after the panel. So the aim of this panel is to discuss the roles that different athlete representatives play in the global and national sports ecosystem. Globally, there's a growing trend of athletes, whether they're self-appointed, non-elected, or unofficial, and or they're representatives who we sometimes say they're elected, they're appointed, or they're official, actively discussing issues that impact elite sport, such as sport governance, competition integrity, anti-doping compliance, and sexual harassment. Elected athlete representatives serve in a variety of arenas and deliberate and vote on policy issues within a legislative and regulatory system of sport governance. Polarized views exist as to the legitimacy and accountability of athletes' representative groups who fall outside the strict elected delegate model of athlete representation. By contrast, advocates of a self-appointed system contend that this aligns with a modern, open and inclusive culture reflective of all athletes' voices. So the aim of this panel is to gain insight from those who, with lived experiences in athlete representation, to create a dialogue about the various forms of athlete representation and develop understandings around the following three areas. Athlete representative attributes, effectiveness, collaboration, coordination, and challenges. So to help facilitate the panel, we will have, after our discussion, we will allow time at the end of the session for audience questions and interaction. So now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, Ashley Labrie, who is the Executive Director for AthletesCAN. As Executive Director, Ashley has been instrumental in building on the athlete representation movement in Canada and globally, advocating for the rights of Canadian athletes for more than 13 years. In her day-to-day, she consults directly with athletes, NSOs and MSO leaders, as well as government officials and international experts in areas such as athlete wellness, safeguarding, representation, and human rights. Ashley has trained upwards of 1,000 athlete representatives and has spoken to more than 5,000 athletes directly in her time with AthletesCAN. Next, we have Matthew Graham, who's Legal and Player Affairs at the World Players Association. Matt is a Switzerland-based Australian labour lawyer, currently responsible for legal and player affairs at the World Players Association. Holding a master's degree of international labour law, he focuses on industrial relations and regulatory issues relevant to the collective representation of professional athletes. He represents athletes' interests in a variety of international forums, such as the Council of Europe, European Commission, and the International Labour Organization. Next, we have Beckie Scott, who was recently awarded Officer of the Order of Canada, a three-time Olympian in cross-country skiing, and is a silver and gold medalist. She was elected to the International Olympic Committee's Athlete Commission for 8 years and chairs the World Anti-Doping Agency Athlete Committee. Our final panelist is Xiao, Chair of the Athletes Advisory Council for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Han was a table tennis athlete who represented the United States in 2007 in the Pan American Games and 4 World Championships. He's a 2008 graduate of the University of Maryland and served on the USA Table Tennis Board of Directors for 8 years. So to start, I would like to ask each of the panelists to share their perspective of how they identify with an athlete representative role. What do they think are the key attributes, or what makes a good representative in this role? And how do you measure your effectiveness within this role? And so Ashley, if you don't mind, I'd like you to start us off, please.
So just a little bit about AthletesCAN. For some of you, this might be repetitive, but we are the collective voice of Canada's national team athletes. We're the first organization of our kind in Canada and the world, and we're the most inclusive athlete organization in Canada. We represent athletes, about 2,500 senior national team active athletes at the Olympic, Paralympic, Commonwealth, Pan, and Para-Pan, and senior world championship level. We've got two main objectives. We provide training and leadership education to athletes to empower them and provide them with the skills and tools to be effective leaders and to influence sport policy. And we advocate on behalf of athletes for priority issues as identified by our members at the sport decision-making tables that they're not necessarily invited to. It is still a struggle. We have been around for 27 years, but it is still a struggle to be engaged at the decision-making tables. We still need to fight our way into a lot of tables, and sometimes we need to crash meetings where we aren't invited. But that's our role. That's what we're here to do to ensure the athlete rights are upheld in sport. In terms of attributes, I think for the leaders of our organization, because we are run by a board of directors made up of athletes, they're really similar to what the roles of our athlete reps are within their own sports. And our values closely align with those attributes. So courage, leadership, transparency, excellence, and the excellence piece is really rooted in our diversity, inclusive and innovative culture, and always with integrity. And I know Dick Pound talked a lot about the use of words and in the last session and really meaning them, but our athletes exemplify all of these attributes in everything that they do, and that goes hand in hand with leadership training and leadership empowerment. In terms of representative nature, and inclusiveness, so typically everything we do is through the lens of inclusivity, and diversity is our strength. So we look at able-bodied, disabled, winter, summer, individual, team, geography, language, ethnicity, male, female, and so much more within each of our discussions, working groups, initiatives. In terms of measuring and evaluating the effectiveness of our organization, we are, as I said, an organization that's run by athletes and for athletes, and we have a strategic plan that's developed by our members. Like that's our operations, and we report on those operations every year with specific key performance indicators to our members at our annual general meeting. So we have three strategic pillars. Leadership, which incorporates the training aspect. It also includes the creation of best practices and athlete representation to support our sports system in managing those structures and leveraging those structures. And then the recognition and celebration of the achievement of our athletes on and off the field of play. And we feel that that's so important to foster and develop athletes as leaders on and off the field of play. We brought back the Canadian Sport Awards 2 years ago. They were essentially non-active because of lack of funding in the system. They didn't feel it was important enough to celebrate athlete achievements. So we took it upon ourselves to make sure that that happened, and we now have 18 awards that we give out annually that recognize a performance on the field of play, but also performance in the area of athlete leadership. Beckie's actually a prime example of that. She received the Athlete Voice Award this year for her work as an athlete advocate. The next area is representation, and that's where we're using our voice to be more effective in terms of sport policy and affecting positive change. And our athletes really drive this piece. They've identified just a few weeks ago that safe sport is our primary objective for this year. Our organization is lean. We have 2 full-time employees with $250,000 budget, and that includes hosting an event similar to this one where we pay for everybody to come and stay and eat for the weekend. So we're lean, we're trying to do a lot with what we have, but we need to stay true to the athletes, and they've identified that priority for this year, knowing our current constraints and capacity, and we're here to deliver on that.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So the World Players Association, it's a relatively new organisation, but it's part of an old movement with a very proud history of advocating and advancing the rights of players. And that movement, there's really two defining aspects to that, and that's one of sacrifice, where players have collectively made immense sacrifices to leave the sport in a better place for the generations to come. So sacrifice, and the flip side of that being the legacy that is left. So the objectives of the Player Association movement are really positive, and that's to advance the collective representation of our members, to make their quality of life better and the participation in sport, which for most of our membership base is of course work. And in terms of the attributes that are involved in how we go about that, well, there's a lot of diversity. So we're here in North America, and many of the major professional unions will be known to the audience, but they will operate very differently to how player associations, for example, in Australia will operate, and Europe and Asia and so on. And I think a good example of that diversity is actually if you have a look at a player association like the Gaelic Player Association in Ireland, where they actually represent 3,500 members who aren't workers, but they have established an effective independent body. They negotiate over a whole range of different matters in terms of player development programs. They negotiate different positions on committees and so on. So the Player Association movement is, of course, very diverse, but I think if you have a look across the board, you can really pick out 5 points which are the common thread between all of our members. And I think that first point is we're player-driven organisations, and we have a clearly defined membership base, and the players are responsible for the direction of where they want to go. So they've set the policies and so on. The connected point to that is we're player-governed organisations. So the players will draft the constitution. The players will appoint the leadership without external interference from management. So to give you an example, typically how that works. So if you're looking at a professional league, for example, there will be a number of club delegates. The club delegates will appoint an executive board. That executive board will then appoint the leadership of the Player Association. Now, who will that leader be? Well, that's up for the players to decide. So once again, if you're looking at the American example, sometimes you have past players like Tony Clark, for example, who's the executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association, but they're not always past players. So if you have a look at Michelle Roberts or Morris Smith or Don Fear, who constitute the other major player associations here in North America, they're not past players, but they have certain skills which make them very effective at advancing, the collective rights of athletes. The third point is that, there's a sense of a player agency involved, and that is the ability to go beyond just consulting and making recommendations, but the ability to collectively bargain and enter into binding agreements on behalf of, your membership base. The fourth point is that these bodies are resourced by the players. The players will determine how they want to allocate the funding and the priorities of their organisations. And the fifth point that sits below all of that is there's an equality of arms involved. So if a collective bargaining agreement is going to be entered into, for an example, the leadership of the player association will have access to certain sort of information that management will have, and in the more sophisticated leagues there will be very sophisticated sort of audits and stuff in terms of all of that information. So when you have these attributes, it's kind of actually easy to determine how effective you're being, because the players will let you know. So the players will have to have the ability to vote down proposals you might make in relation to a collective bargaining agreement, for example. On the more extreme end, they can actually take back control of the union and put a new leadership base in place. And we actually saw that happen here a few years ago with the NBPA when they installed Michelle Roberts, and now they're one of the most, if not the most successful player association in professional sport. So that's how we know we're effective, because the players aren't shy about letting us know.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everyone. My name is Beckie, and I am the chair of the WADA Athlete Committee. We are a appointed committee, and whatever. We can talk about that later. But to speak a little bit, perhaps, to appointment, the appointments are based on the attempt to ensure diversity across all of the athletes who are subject to the code, so that includes Olympic, Paralympic, non-Olympic, and professional, of course, across all nations, geographies, gender, etc. So it is a complex matrix to try to fill, and appointment is the best solution that has been developed so far. The purpose of the committee is really to represent the rights and views of athletes as it represents anti-doping on a global scale. And we do that through a number of ways and means. It's meetings, it's conference calls, it's forums, and most importantly, it's engagement with the athlete community and trying to understand and intake their concerns, their thoughts, and their experience as it relates to anti-doping, and to bring that back and to be the voice at the table for athletes at the WADA Executive Committee and Foundation Board level. I think the key attributes in my experience of chairing this committee, I've been the chair for about 5.5 years. The committee itself was formed in 2005. The most effective athlete representatives that I have seen come and go on the committee, and some of whom are still there, are of course an interest and experience in anti-doping, and particularly integrity issues in sport, but also a very firm commitment to independence and an ability to remain uncompromised by external pressures. We heard a lot this morning about sport governance coming under pressure and the conflict of interest that exists inherently in sport organizations. As athlete representatives, I think it is almost the most important and defining factor in your role as an athlete representative to be accountable first and foremost to the athletes, and to not succumb or to be unduly influenced by organizations or other interests external to that, because athletes are counting on you. And in particular, with respect to anti-doping, I think there's a number of us on the committee who take that responsibility very seriously, and it doesn't go over always very well. But how do you measure and evaluate the effectiveness of what we do in representing athletes? I think that's a bit of an intangible in some ways. I don't know that you can put numbers or statistics to that necessarily. I think we can measure that in a lot of ways by the trust and the confidence and the faith that we experience when we engage with the athlete community, that we are a trusted voice within the organization, that we do have people come to us with their issues and with their concerns, that when we hold a forum, people come and they know that the conversation is open, that the door is open for them to be there and to talk frankly and honestly about their concerns and what they feel their experiences in anti-doping. And I think that's really all to say on that. Thank you.
Good morning, my name's Han. I'm the chair of the United States Athletes Commission, or Athletes Advisory Council. Our Athletes Commission is a little bit unique, I think, in the world in that we're very large. We have a representative from every single sport and a number of Paralympic representatives as well. So we're a very, very large body with a leadership group of 6 athletes who do the primary lifting in sort of engaging with the NOC and the other stakeholders. So we're a little bit unique in structure. I think for the most part we identify, just like most athletes commissions, primarily with currently competing athletes who are competing in Olympic and Paralympic disciplines from the World Championship level up, I would say. But I think with everything that's happened in the United States around sexual abuse and around the discussion around resources going to athletes, the definition of athlete is a little bit of a gray area for us that we're continuously working to try to better define. I think we do think a lot about pipeline development and how do we make things better for the next generation of athletes. So when we talk about those issues, the definition of athlete and the athletes that we tend to identify with tends to expand. And obviously when we're talking about things like sexual abuse and maltreatment of minors, that opens up a completely whole universe of junior athletes and children. So when you ask, which athletes do we identify with, I think more and more it tends to be all athletes, but depending on the issue that you're talking about, we tend to have to prioritize, especially when we're talking about resources and things like that. But when we talk about athletes' rights and human rights and things like that, obviously we're considering and relating to a much broader group of athletes, and I think athletes commissions in the past have been sort of more concentrating on or relating to. So I think that's an ongoing evolution in the world of athlete representation that's very interesting to me. In terms of the skills that I think someone in our role, since we are elected, tends to need, I think first and foremost, we get the notion a lot that people expect us to represent sort of everyone all the time, and we're expected to bring consensus to the table on a lot of different issues, when I think most athletes in the room will recognize that, in my sport I can't get 5 athletes to agree on any topic. So it's on the sort of nearly impossible to get consensus on anything. And so I think a key skill of a representative in our position is to be able to engage different athletes and understand the different viewpoints on the different issues, and to really strike a balance between just communicating what the athletes are saying and then sort of adding your own understanding of the issues and coming forward with a concrete piece of feedback or policy recommendation based on all of that to synthesize everything and put forward something that you think makes sense for the general athlete body. And that can be very difficult, and a lot of times I think it's in the best interest of the representative to be honest and to present the different viewpoints rather than just presenting one viewpoint as the athlete viewpoint. That's been a little bit of a difficult a challenge at times, but I do think that that's a very sort of important skill for someone in our position to have. Another one that I think Beckie touched on in one way that I completely agree with is the utmost integrity in this position. In our position, I think a lot of times we are talking about a lot of the topics that we brought up in this, even in the last couple of days, around corruption in sport, anti-doping, conflicts of interest, all of these things. And I've noted that sometimes there is already a gap in how athletes are held accountable versus how other people in the movement are held accountable. I think athletes are held to a much higher degree of accountability sometimes. And I think as an athlete representative, it feels like if you don't stand for that, the utmost integrity, and there's nothing that people can pick out about you and the way that you behave and the way you act, then there's very little room to talk about these other issues in sport. And so it becomes almost like you have to overcompensate. So I think that's really important for the representatives to keep in mind. Finally, I'll sort of touch on the how do we measure ourselves, and it is pretty intangible sometimes. I think it changes a lot based on what your current initiatives are. For us, when we talk to athletes, to be honest, a lot of the athletes on the ground still don't understand what the Athletes Commission does or what it is. But I think more and more people that we engage with who are interested in tackling issues at the NF level or the NOC level are aware of the things that we're saying. We have been in the public eye a little bit more, and to engage with them and to get a thank you for what we're doing or what we're saying, I think that's the biggest validation. And even athletes who previously were not on board with what we were doing or sort of were skeptical about the value of the AAC, we've converted some of them, and I think that's a pretty big validation as well. But for us, one of the current things that we're working towards and we measure ourselves on is, since there's so much discussion about athlete representation as a concept in general, I think we're measuring a lot of our success on the changes that we're seeing in the United States on how people view athlete representation as a whole and the value that they're putting on it, especially at the NF level when we talk to our NGB council and their willingness to accept that there's value in the athlete voice and wanting to incorporate that more and willing to listen to us about some ways that they can better incorporate the athlete voice. I think that's a huge win for us. So I think there's different ways to evaluate, but it's something that we're definitely working on.
Thank you. So now I want to shift to collaboration, coordination. I think some international federation administrators have tried to put a divide and conquer between the different types of athlete representatives or bodies versus thinking about collaboration and coordination. So Matt, from your perspective and in your unique experience, to what extent do you think these different types of athlete representatives can work together in terms of hearing the athlete's voice in sport governance?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I think that's a really interesting question. But I think, before you get to it, you actually have to take a step back and almost ask yourself, to what extent can those responsible for sports governance ensure the rights of athletes to be represented are consistent with, the sports governing body's corporate responsibility to respect human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we're speaking about the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, we're of course talking about respect for freedom of association, which means the right to form and join associations of your own choosing. So I think that's sort of the threshold question. And in terms of how sports governing bodies can ensure respect for freedom of association, there's actually three very simple things that can be done in relation to that. So, the first is to communicate to athletes that they actually have the right to form these bodies. The second point is, where committees are in place within the governance structures, that they don't serve to function as a substitute for independent representation. And the third point is where athletes are seeking to get organised and establishing these associations is to not push back and interfere with that endeavour. So there's three simple points that can be done in relation to ensuring respect for freedom of association. And then you look at the question from a different paradigm. So if it comes to cooperation, well, the reality is, by virtue of the fact that the player association movement has been around for such a long time, we've got a lot of leadership and expertise that we're willing to share, and we're willing to help promote other athlete groups, go down this path towards unionisation. So, for example, our president, Don Fear, has been involved with Ash's organisation, AthletesCAN, in the past, and I know now he's also been offering some sort of strategic support to Hahn's initiative. In other sports, for example, where committees are in place, we actually negotiate the committees. So, if you have a look at rugby's a really interesting example where at the global level there is a international union federation, but then there's also a player advisory council within World Rugby, but the members of that are nominated by the union, so there's close collaboration there.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Beckie, when we were prepping for this, we were talking about your experiences, and I would say for about 3 years you've been subject to public and private attacks that undermine WADA AC. And so I'm curious, how can maybe the different types of athlete representatives help athletes that are being bullied, attacked, for speaking out and saying the right thing, because you talked about integrity. Could you maybe speak to, is there collaboration possibilities to help people like yourself who are trying to do the right thing?
I think there's an obvious opportunity for collaboration across the spectrum of athlete representation, and I really don't think that there's one perfect model or one group necessarily that is entitled or empowered to speak on behalf of all athletes. I do have the lived experience of the divide and conquer strategy for the last 3 years, and can say that on the positive side, it actually galvanized the members of the committee who were there for the right reasons and who do approach their role with integrity and principles, and who are genuinely trying to help athletes in their experience with anti-doping come together a little bit more. I think outside of that and beyond that, we have many great examples of athlete committees and athlete organizations, such as the World Players, such as AthletesCAN, such as Athletes Germany, who have really mobilized and strengthened their core functions and operations and become meaningful voices at the table. So we look to them for examples and inspiration, and also in some circumstances, collaboration and cooperation.
What's your experience? Is it any different than what Beckie and Matt have shared?
No, I do think there's real opportunity for collaboration. One of the things that I've noted that sport organizations are often criticized for being very insular. There's really a lack of different ideas coming in and really able to challenge the status quo. And to some extent, we find that when we're discussing issues, we have to look at that a little bit as well, because we're coming from that world. So most of the solutions that we're discussing can be limited in scope. So we're drawing from our athlete experiences. We're drawing from, to some degree, some of our professional experiences. We're not necessarily looking too far beyond that. And sometimes it's very refreshing to be able to collaborate with some outside voices, whether it's role players, whether it's other athletes commissions. Just the more that we can interact with other athlete representation, I think we open ourselves up to more possibilities, because a lot of these problems have been solved in different spheres, and not just sport. And so I think it's a real promising direction moving forward, is to be able to have more of that discussion and conversation across different athlete bodies.
Yeah. So actually, I'm hoping you can answer this question, but what I'm reading right now in terms of what's going on is there are different athletes groups, whether they're self-appointed, whatever you want to call it, and elected, but we still have maybe administrations coaching certain elected athletes commissions, saying don't listen to them, they're not legitimate, and not, again, dividing versus helping groups come together. How do you see maybe your role as AthletesCAN or another body like that to help work with athletes so that they're together as one versus pitting against each other?
Yeah, well, I think that issue is intrinsic to our success or our effectiveness as an organization, because we are inclusive. We do represent athletes that fall under other internal structural commissions and councils, like the COC Athletes Commission, like the CPC Athletes Council, the Commonwealth Games Athletes Council. And in order to say that we represent all national team athletes in Canada, that means we represent them as well. And so we need to include them in the conversations that we're having around the various priorities and stances that we're taking on various issues. So we have to work with them, and we're happy to do that because they are members of AthletesCAN. It has been definitely a challenge, I would say, over the last number of years, because our Canadian Not-for-Profit Act did not allow us to appoint people to boards. So we used to actually have those athletes sit on our board of directors. So they were basically part of our leadership. Now it's a little less formal, so the relationship is a bit more informal, I guess you could say. We're not in conversation as much as we were before, so it's really intentional communication between the two groups. And where the issues come up, like you said, is when the administration of an organization doesn't understand the need for an independent body. They can't wrap their minds around the fact that why can't we just deal with that internally? And so they're putting pressure on their council or commission to say, why aren't you dealing with this issue? And really, those athletes are either saying, well, our position is completely different than what you want it to be, and so we need this independent body to advocate for us. So we've really had to create some clear lines of who deals with what, so that we're not stepping on each other's toes, but that we're supporting each other where we need to be. So an example for Olympic team selection comes up. Our Canadian Olympic Committee, Athletes Commission will deal with that. If they need support in terms of capacity to action that, then they can come to us and ask us. When it's something that impacts more than just Olympic athletes, like our Paralympic athletes or national team athletes that don't compete at those games, then we are the ones that take the lead on that, and we collaborate with those partners. So we have to do it to be effective in our representation structure, and really the elected versus appointed piece, it's just a matter of capacity. We don't have any control over that at the moment in our system. Obviously, best practice for us would be elected by your peers. The next best would be appointed by your peers, and then that's where the buck stops actually for us.
All right. So that was a nice segue into challenges. We've mentioned like one challenge is this divide and conquer, and how do you work with that? In terms of structure of national sport organizations, what do you see as some of the challenges around how they're structured that helps you be effective as an athlete representative?
A couple of major things. I think I talked about it yesterday, but the lack of professionalization has been a real structural challenge for us. I know, some athletes commissions have more staff support than others, but that's been a consistent challenge to be able to engage athletes on a consistent basis. But I think a bigger one that's more fundamental is the leverage that the Athletes Commission has. So basically, we have several routes that we can go. The primary route is obviously, directly through the NSC, engaging with the board, with the athlete directors on the board, with the executive leadership and the staff of the NOC. So in order to do that, you basically build up some goodwill, try to prove your competence, and establish sort of what you're about as an athlete representative, what your goals are, to establish that trust. Now, when that fails, in order to get your issues discussed or pushed through, you have pretty limited alternatives, because you have a 4-year term. It's not like you're there for 20 years and you can slowly try to change people's minds. It's a push the initiative through. Oftentimes, for us, it's you have a very short window because there's not much continuity. So that's a sort of structural issue as well. But then your other opportunities are to really sort of try to pull other stakeholders who usually aren't interested into the equation. So the public or the government or things like that. And that can be very scary, because by doing that, you're risking the leverage that you had before, the limited leverage that you had before, to the goodwill of the organization towards you. And so I think that's a huge structural challenge of athletes commissions in general, is because in order to take a more extreme action to try to, to push your agenda through, you risk quite a lot.
Yeah, Beckie, do you want to add?
I would just add to that, I think there are some inherent structural challenges that feel at times almost designed to for athlete commissions not to be effective. And we're talking about, athlete representatives who come into an organization or into a commission at a time in their life. Usually they're just very close to post-retirement. They're trying to reintegrate into work or school and start a family at the same time. They're expected to volunteer a tremendous amount of time and energy to the organization and to the cause. And then they're not necessarily given the tools or equipped with the proper information or knowledge or ability to come to the table and actually be an effective voice. So they're thrown into this cycle of ineffectiveness and tossed out after 3 or 4 years, and it starts all over again. So I think that the model itself is really almost designed to fail, in that we aren't enabling and empowering and bringing strong athlete representatives to the tables of the NOCs and of the IFs. And we're seeing, again, models coming out of this, like AthletesCAN and Athletes Germany, where there's a recognition that you need experienced, knowledgeable, skilled people who are able to advocate and act and speak on behalf of athletes. Otherwise, there's not much point.
Right. Because it goes back to, I believe, Dick Pound said in his session early this morning that athletes weren't skilled enough. Was that the term he used? It was an interesting perspective from his experience. So I guess, Matt, I'll throw this at you. So how do we fix that? How do we coach athletes to do governance? How do we have the right individuals in those spots? And should those people coaching athletes be within the NSO or the International Federation, or should they be an independent person? Because do you really want the internal people coaching them how to frame legislation that's probably going to be for their benefit? So how do you work with athletes so that we have the right skilled individuals serving in governance?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I think that kind of goes back to the point I was making before about respect for, freedom of association, where it's actually up to the athletes to determine how they want to be represented. So, the theme of this panel is who has the right to stand up for the athlete's voice, and it is the athletes in terms of how they choose to, without the interference or otherwise from the sport governing bodies. So I think that's sort of the point on that. But I think even in terms of where we sit as the player association movement, we still have a number of challenges as well. So I think I'll just quickly run you through some of them, because these challenges can be broken down into three categories. I mean, we have our own structural sort of challenges where there may be legal barriers under national law, for example, that even where the players want to get organised, they can't due to the specific frameworks of certain national jurisdictions. So a really good example of that was actually a few years ago here when there was a push by college athletes to organise, but then the National Labour Relations Board, effectively circumvented that effort because it didn't find that they were employees. So that's then in contrast with this international standard for freedom of association. And then more globally, we still see that in a number of jurisdictions. So for example, it's still an ongoing challenge in cricket to establish a genuine player association in India, despite that being the biggest sport by some margin in that country. The tide is slowly starting to change. We're seeing more and more player associations emerge, and I'm happy to see Kihl Yamazaki from our executive committee here, who's been quite instrumental in recently establishing a player association in South Korea, where that's a very difficult jurisdiction to do so. So that is pleasing, but these structural barriers still exist. And then I think the second point, and I think this picks up on what Beckie and Han and Ash were alluding to, is that on top of that you still have these cultural barriers where those who are responsible for the governance of sport are hesitant about any sort of representation that is outside of what they have traditionally regulated and allowed. And I think a good example of that, last year an IOC member was quoted as saying about world players that we talked the right talk but did not think the right thing. We did it in a union way. Now, I don't know what thinking the right thing actually involves, but I think that sort of underscores some of the cultural barriers that exist at the highest levels of sport, where despite the track record of the player association movement, demonstrating that it's a win-win both for the athletes and for the sport as well, that there is this nervousness to embrace the athlete voice. And then the outcome of those two sort of factors, we have these structural barriers and cultural barriers, is that a lot of sports just haven't developed a union consciousness. The reality is organising athletes is hard work, and it takes exceptional leadership and commitment to sustain the efforts. And it's encouraging to see that the voice is growing, but it's a long way to realise that.
Ashley, in your experience, other than what is being shared, what are some other challenges that you see from your perspective?
So, athlete representation, or formal athlete representation within governance structures in Canada has been an ongoing movement slowly over the years, and most recently we were funded to carry out some research in this area. And so some of the things that we found, both from the athletes and the national sport organizations and multi-sport organization leadership around the generalizations and thoughts around athlete leadership were in relation to structure. So skills and competency-based boards versus representative boards. And in Canada, with the new Not-for-Profit Act, we need to move more to competencies-based. We can no longer have representative boards, which has proven to be a huge setback for athlete representation. We lost about 50% of our athlete directors when this change was made. Actually, sport lawyers in Canada were encouraging NSOs to drop their athlete director because it would make compliance within the CNCA more difficult in terms of how do we find a way for them to be elected by the members. So that was a major setback for us, and that's why we started this project. But we believe that the generalization that athletes don't have the competencies that are required to serve on a board of directors is false. We believe that for a successful board, you need to have expertise on the high performance training competition environment. Athletes are the most informed stakeholder in that respect. And also, the other piece is that there are countless numbers of athletes who are professionals in their own right outside of sport that have greater competencies than some of the people that are representing the sport on the board of directors. So We think that's a false statement, and that athletes can very well serve on competencies-based boards, and that they would serve to create a more effective representation as well. The token board members versus the valued board members, this is one of the biggest barriers for athletes to be effective in their roles, when boards don't value them as an equal contributor to the board. And that comes back to the idea that an athlete is an athlete voice representative only and can't contribute in any other way. And then the value-adding skills versus skills development. So again, athletes are seen as people that need to be taught or need to learn and work really hard to understand what's going on at the table, where we feel that they're both value-added members of the board, but also that it is a win-win for the organization to develop these leaders, because these are probably the leaders that will go on to lead your organization and lead the sport in your country, or internationally for that matter. And then there's operations in terms of conflict of interest. This is probably one of the biggest barriers that we hear from athletes. Conflict of interest is essentially weaponized to exclude athletes from the decision-making tables within sport, especially in Canadian sport. And it's always, well, you're an active athlete and this conversation is impacting all of your athletes, so you can't be a part of it because conflict of interest. In Canadian sport, we have parents of athletes that are on the national team that are sitting on boards of directors. We have high-performance directors that are sitting on boards of directors. The number of conflicts of interest that exist outside of an athlete, a so-called conflict of interest, is immense. So as part of this project, we're creating best practices in terms of how to deal with conflict of interest, specific procedures, because typically if there's a conflict of interest, you would announce it and you would deal with it in a certain way, not to exclude you from the conversation. So we believe that these challenges can be overcome. Primarily, they're culturally based challenges, and we just need to educate those empowerment.
We just have one more question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I'm curious in terms of challenges, that the issue of voting and the weighting of votes. Like athletes, if you're sitting on an executive board, basically you get one vote, or how many representatives are on that committee, and it's maybe two max, or sometimes they don't even get a vote. I'm curious why that's not perceived as an issue, because from my perspective, unless you even out the votes or you have a weighted voting system, it would be very difficult to pass legislation. So is there any talk about how athletes are trying to position themselves, or position some policy around how do we change the voting weights? Tom, do you want to jump in there?
Thanks for that. For us, it's a really sensitive topic. It goes back to the structural challenges that we talked about.
Yeah.
I think most of us would see some situations where having 50% could work, especially if you recognize that there are different types of athlete constituencies that you could represent with that 50%. So you could better represent athletes who retired a little bit longer, to have them provide input on sort of policies that affect retired athletes a little bit more, especially career transition, mental health, all these different types of things that maybe have manifested in the time since they've retired, that may not have manifested for a recently retired athlete yet, or maybe they haven't quite processed that. And we're starting to do that in the United States. But there's also grassroots and things like that, people who deal more with youth and more with youth coaching and things like that. So there are some sort of areas where 50% could make sense, but from our perspective, we also have the political consideration of all the other stakeholders involved. So all the NFs, the independent directors, all of that. And in our discussions, every time we felt like if we allowed out 50%, we would be perceived a certain way. And it would really limit our impact to be able to make recommendations in other areas that are more sort of immediately impactful. Mm-hmm. And it feels a little bit like selling the farm, but it is a consideration. So that's sort of, I think, part of the difficulty for the elected athletes commissions to be able to really push for 50%.
Does anybody else want to? Yeah, Beckie.
I can speak to that a little bit. It's quite current at the moment. It was within WADA, and that WADA just underwent a 2-year governance review process and came up with a series of reforms. And even in spite of the fact that we had a representative from the WADA Athlete Committee as part of this working group, and in spite of the fact that we really advocated strongly for a voting seat at the table of the executive and foundation boards, and in spite of the fact that there was a growing mobilization of athletes outside of that to organization in that process who were very strong and very vocal. Ali Jawad comes to mind, advocating for stronger athlete representation, and one voting seat at the table, it was denied. And the rationale that we got was that we have a representation issue that we need to solve before we can get a voting seat at the table, rather than giving a seat at the table and then helping us address the issue of representation. It was just determined, well, you don't get a seat until you solve this yourselves. So we haven't given up. We did form a working group on representation in order to try to make some inroads and try to gain a seat at the table, but recognizing that this wasn't actually desired by the organization in the end of the day, and that was disappointing, to say the least.
Do you want, Matt, did you want to respond?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I think that sort of just illustrates what the problem is that, you know, the athletes need to have an equal say. And I think there's 2 ways in essence you can actually guarantee that. And the first way is through negotiating collective bargaining agreements, which is what the player associations typically do, or the second way is through implementing governance processes which actually are going to deliver that. So in the case of WADA, for example, we have put forward a governance reform proposal which would see the WADA Foundation Board restructured to be 1/3 government, 1/3 sport, 1/3 athletes. And it's only once that's achieved that you're actually going to have equal say in the effective development of these rules.
Okay, I'm going to open it up. We have a gentleman right here at the microphone is right there, and then I will get you this time. And then Nikki, and then right there.
Thank you. A couple of observations and then one question. First law of democracy is learn to count. If you don't walk into the room with the votes, you're not going to win. Second point, if you don't walk in with the law, you're going to get crushed. I would suggest the best measure of your success as an athlete representative is to count the number of knives in your back. I think it's by far and away the best measure, so well done, Beckie, on that front. You scored well. For 2 years in British athletics, as the British governing body was going under in the 90s when it went bankrupt, we achieved 50% voting rights on the commercial rights of the sport in an effort to save it, and that was the one time that we achieved a 50-50 status on all of the commercial rights. We did it because we got 15 of the top athletes together, collectively talking with the governing body. Lo and behold, in that 2 years, the governing body realised we wanted nearly all the same things that they did, and the relationships, unfortunately, as the governing body couldn't save the sport, went under. We were successful. I think what we have to realise is that we are fighting hundreds of years almost of ingrained prejudice against athletes. We're fighting criminal, multi-billion-pound stakeholders who are not going to give this away to us because we walk in the room and we're right. That's the least of their worries. That's the absolute least of their concerns. We have to up our game significantly and understand what we need to do. The reason we can be effective is because we're the only thing the governing bodies and the federations are afraid of. Because athletes can actually change things, because we can change the commercial dynamic. Without it doesn't happen. I think for all of us, we have to significantly up our game and understand what we need to achieve.
Thank you. Anybody, that was a comment, basically?
Yeah.
Okay. A gentleman right here in the blue suit.
Hi, Rob Keeler, Global Athlete. I'm going to make a comment first, and I'm going to direct it to Beckie. And then to build on the comment here is what you've done over the past 3 years. I don't think there's any athlete out there that has taken more blows than you have, that has garnered more respect for your leadership and your adversity. So my question is 2 questions. Is why do you think even your own organization that you represent and the Olympic movement have targeted you so often and so regularly to undermine everything you're doing? And two, as a volunteer, what has kept you in that position?
I ask myself that a lot. What is the problem? Yeah, that's a good question, Rob. And I actually have asked myself that a lot and thought about it a lot. Why, when I have, and Linda spoke to this in her talk this morning as well. When she came into the organization, it was with the purest of intent, and really with the idea of coming to make a difference and to contribute to a cause that I cared very deeply about and actually was personally impacted by. So I have the lived experience of someone who went to the Olympics and brought home a bronze medal that should have been a gold because of doping. Yes, it inspired me to fight for a level playing field and for fairness and equality of opportunity in sport because it affected me personally many years ago. But over the years, I have come to really appreciate the importance of it, like what sport represents to us as a society, and how crucial it is that we protect it and protect its integrity and that it's fair and remains a place of principles for all. Why this has come to be such an uncomfortable conversation for so many people is really a question I don't know the answer to be honest. I think the WADA Athlete Committee, as we have grown in our ability to know, the landscape and to become a stronger voice, we have faced, with that incrementally, we have faced, the resistance and the push and the pressure back to stay back into a place that keeps everyone comfortable. I think the answer there is that we've just made a lot of people really uncomfortable. To your second question, why am I still here? I think it's there's two answers to that. One, of course, is the committee members themselves, one of whom is here with me today. I have some incredibly broad shoulders that stand shoulder to shoulder with me, and I lean on very heavily at times, and they have been the wisdom and the conviction and the support that has steered me through fronting the Athlete Committee for many years and through many moments of real tough moments. The other reason I'm still here is because I still believe in it. I still believe it's a cause worth fighting for and worth standing up for, and in spite of the personal toll that it's taken, I know how many athletes out there rely on having someone speak for them, rely on having a voice at the table, because I was one of those athletes who had tremendous faith and really needed to trust that there was people speaking on behalf of clean sport and trying to maintain integrity in sport. So that's why I'm still here and still doing it. Thank you.
My question's about money and funding. So not necessarily prize money, which is the focus of a lot of elite athletes, but money that you guys need to get to actually do this volunteer work. And I know this topic came up at the IOC athletes meeting earlier this year, but it's, there's translation, there's, coordination, there's administrative support that would be so helpful for you, and looking at you two in particular, to be able to execute your roles. How much support are you getting financially and administratively to run your athletes' work? And how can we get more?
So I'll answer from our perspective. We get approximately $175,000 per year right now from the USOBC. So our Athletes Commission is sort of protected under the Amateur Sports Act here, but there's no sort of budget number or like sort of ballpark budget specified. So it's very much up to the organization right now. That's enough to run 2 to 3 meetings per year with everybody, since we're such a large commission, and to send some of our leadership to conferences. It's probably like 2 or 3 per year of travel, basically. It's not really enough to do anything else. So in the current process, we're trying to work with the NOC to try to figure out how to get some additional resources, but obviously there's some logistical challenges around that. For example, how can we guarantee that whatever increases persist, even if they are upset about one of our initiatives or something like that. How do we maintain a certain level of independence and empowerment to do what we need to do and say what we need to say when our budget is sort of in the control of the organization. But I mean, that's our current status right now.
Marina Schweitzer from National Public Radio in Germany. I want to get to the point of the cycle of ineffectiveness that Beckie talked about, and also the structures that Han talked about. You talked about consensus that is often asked, and I was wondering, let's look at, for example, the Rule 40. The IOC, for example, said that it wasn't the opinion of all athletes around the world that the Rule 40 should be changed, basically, or get more money to the athletes in the end. So what's your answer to the problem that maybe you could be handicapped by having one voice on a board maybe that has to represent some sort of consensus from athletes from all over the world? What is your answer if you feel handicapped? That's what I hear from how you're describing the structures. Han and Beckie.
I think that's part of what I was talking about with, I think that's a norm that has to change. That, first of all, the one seat is a very difficult position, but I think people have to get used to the fact that you have to allow your athlete representatives to put forward different athlete viewpoints as part of the broad spectrum of the viewpoints that athletes hold, which I actually think is one of the things that even the IOC Athletes Commission does, at least when I talk to them, has tried to do. Now, whether we agree with them or not is a different story, but they at least are saying, I agree with that part. Not every athlete from every country is going to have the same opinion on Rule 40, and I get that. But I think that the fact that we expect the representatives to only put forward ideas or recommendations when there's consensus, I think that's a little bit a reason why we see the movement being so slow and why there's so much inertia. So I think that being able to open up the discussion about some different possible solutions, rather than just saying, well, this is too hard, I think that's something that I would like to see change, and to change that norm, to change that expectation of the athlete representatives to only put forward something when you have consensus.
But how can you vote then if you have you have one?
I think it's up to your conscience. I mean, it's like I think you have to, at the end of the day, you have to look in the mirror and say, did I represent the broad athlete group the best that I thought, based on the things that I'm hearing, based on the way I see the future? And you have to, I mean, it sounds a little bit arrogant, but at some point you have to trust yourself that that you're doing this for the right reason, that you are trying your best to represent as many athletes as possible with the broader athlete body. So, I mean, all of our rules are a little bit different, but I think at the end of the day, it's sort of what's inside you, why you're doing it.
And we'll finish that, but I'll just say some of the research that I've done and talked to different athlete representatives. They've said this similar thing to what Hans said. It's very hard to represent 25 sports, that some are winter versus summer, some are team sports, some are individual, but bottom line is, look at the legislation, hear the feedback, and what makes sense based on your experience, expertise. So I think people who are representatives are generally trying to do the right thing, and they were elected to be representatives. If people don't like what they voted for, then they get elected out. That's the delegate model, right? So it is a challenge, but that's representation in any type of context, whether it's government or whatever system we're in. So it's not easy being a representative. So thank you for our distinguished panelists. I really appreciate you giving us the time, preparing and sharing your perspectives. This was great conversation, and I hope we have more athlete conversations, and there's continued shift of having the athlete's voice being involved in decision making and voting and having that power. So thank you, and I believe we have lunch right now. So
Nancy, I didn't even get to say hello. I'm really good. How are you? Yes. Yeah, I'm so proud of the Canadians. Yeah.